Well, thank you very much for listening.
You've obviously done quite a lot of work with Gen Z in the diaspora, but I think generally, particularly in America and Britain, the history of the Jews here has been, thankfully, a lot happier than, say, mainland Europe. Given that probably the vast majority of Israeli Jews and the Gen Z people there are descendants from people who were basically refugees and had nowhere else to go, did you do any research with Gen Z in Israel? And is there a danger maybe of a schism maybe between the diaspora and the Israeli Jewish communities in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I didn't survey or interview any Gen Z Israeli Jews because my focus was the UK. And I think the experience of young Israeli Jews is just very, very different to young Jews in the diaspora. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that research seems to show that younger Israeli Jews are actually more right-wing than often their parents and grandparents. So you're kind of seeing the opposite dynamic that we're seeing playing out in North America and I think in a significant segment of British Anglo-Jewry. So I'm not particularly hopeful about the current Gen Z Israeli Jewish population in the way that the American Gen Z and UK and some of the UK Gen Z population do give me a lot of hope. So I think you're right to then ask, could we then be seeing this kind of schism opening up? I think that is a huge issue in terms of how in future years will Anglo-Jews, North American Jews, how will they relate to what is still the other half of global Jewry, which resides within the state of Israel. Now, how that will play out, I don't know, but I think you're right to suggest that you could just see this widening schism.
Your research seems to have maybe deliberately or intentionally or not avoided the question to the young Jews that you referred to in your research about their view on the historical events that led to the Palestinian suffering, the catastrophe, specifically the Nakba. That's my first question. So, was this deliberate, or did you just not want to tackle it? Second question, you mentioned in your talk that they wanted Jewish-led pro-Palestine activism because they weren't happy with the wider anti-Semitism that they saw in the pro-Palestine movement. Have they elaborated on that? What type of anti-Semitism they experienced?
Thank you for those questions. Yeah, sorry, I haven't been able to share with you all the data that I've collected, and there's lots more that I could have said and shared with you. And to your point about their historical understanding, actually that's one of the really interesting things that comes out from talking to people, is that they describe to me a journey that they've been on, and part of that journey is a kind of a knowledge journey, an intellectual journey, and an understanding that the version of Israel's creation has been a highly partial one that has obscured to them the Palestinian experience. And so what many of them talk to me about is the way that they had to sort of go through their own process of self-education, part self-education and part sort of unlearning things that they had been taught typically through their youth movements about the creation of the state of Israel, and yes, learning about the Nakba and having to kind of teach themselves this critical part of the history, because if you don't understand that part of the story, you can't really understand what's the problem, what's going on, what's all this about. So they go on a journey. Often that journey begins with the experience they have where they actually get to talk to Palestinians face to face. That's one of the another one of the standout findings, the impact of personal encounter and how transformational that can be for them. And having had that experience, then everything else starts to kind of unravel. And the way in which they then start putting the pieces together again for themselves is by broadening their understanding of history. So I would say relearning and unlearning is a very important part of the journeys that they've been on, and the NACRA is a big part of that. On your other question about why does sort of half the cohort seems to be saying that they preferred to show their Palestinian solidarity within kind of Jewish-led spaces. In the survey, there wasn't the opportunity to kind of say specifically what they were thinking of, or what particularly, or give me any examples. In the interviews, I was able to kind of bring this out, or ask a little bit more about it, particularly with those people who I was interviewing after the 7th of October. And there were a number of people who said to me they were quite shocked by the fact that people that they may be campaigning alongside, or they considered to be fellow activists on this cause, that they were very upset basically by the lack of sort of sympathy or empathy towards what happened to the Israelis on October the 7th. And they said this to me, a number of people said this to me, that they were surprised and slightly shocked by the way in which that was so easily dismissed. Now, what it didn't do though was change their fundamental understanding and their fundamental outlook. So even though they felt uncomfortable about some of the pro-Palestinian, non-Jewish responses that they were seeing, typically online, it didn't change their fundamental understanding of the issue in terms of the fundamental injustices of the situation in Israel-Palestine. But it did clearly, rock them, if you like, and they found it very difficult to kind of wrap their heads around the fact that even though they knew that the world didn't start on October the 7th, and what Hamas did has a very full context to it, they just felt very uncomfortable with the fact that people weren't willing to acknowledge the horror that had happened for those southern Israeli communities.
I wonder whether the change in attitude amongst this demographic has caused conflict within families or with the religious leaders, or whether they rather just make up alternative arrangements or alternative groupings.
It was a question I asked because I was interested in understanding what impact had this had on their own family relationships, and quite a few people said to me that it was incredibly divisive, and they might fall out with parents or siblings or other kind of extended family. Others told me a story where actually the younger generation were influencing the older generation, and they were actually able to engage with conversations with their parents or their other relations, and kind of get to a better place, and find that their relations were willing to kind of hear them out. So there was a mixed bag of experiences, but it was definitely a question that I wanted to ask people, because I know from my own experience the impact it can have on family relationships, and I wanted to know whether that was happening for that generation.
Also the religious leaders. I mean, I don't know how that works. Is that a challenge to...
I think what they're observing is this ethical dissonance. So that they were raised within formal Jewish spaces. They went to synagogues, they went to Jewish youth movements, some of them went to Jewish day schools. And so they were raised with a very positive understanding of what is the essence of Judaism. as a faith, and that's had a huge impact on them. But then when they see what's happening in terms of Israel-Palestine, or they hear how community leaders speak about it or don't speak about it, they then wrestle with this sort of internal mental dissonance, and that this doesn't match up. And what you taught me, the values that you wanted me to love and to cherish, I don't see those actually being expressed by these institutions.
How do the leaders react?
Okay. On the whole, the reaction is often just to kind of marginalise them. So to say, well, okay, yeah, there's a few young dissident Jews. They just want to be in with the cool gang, or they are naive, or they don't really understand their own Jewish history. These kind of responses were particularly the reason why I wanted to study young Jews that had actually grown up within these institutional spaces. Because I wanted to research a group that you could not accuse them of not understanding what it meant to be Jewish. And you could not accuse them of not understanding Jewish history, or not knowing about the Holocaust, or not knowing about Jewish values and ethics or religious traditions. They are absolutely steeped in it. And I think this is what makes them interesting. And I think if that group of people are transforming their outlook and their understanding, then that's very, very significant. So if you are the people who are typically my age that are running all these institutions or synagogues or communal bodies, you kind of don't want to engage with that because it's incredibly problematic. And I think the response at the moment has been at best to say, yeah, we recognise that there is this segment, or that younger people are less connected or less emotionally drawn towards Israel, but we just need to get our education better. We just need to make better TikTok videos, because the ones they're watching aren't great, so we need to make better ones. So what the institutions aren't doing is recognising that something might be wrong with the institutions. I'm kind of waiting for the penny to drop, for institutional leadership to recognise that it's not just a matter of, we need to do better Israel education, or we need to kind of get more people doing Israel tours when they're 16. Actually, we need to look at, well, what is it that we're actually defending?
You talked about the fact that this is a sort of their view of it, in terms of Gen Z, is around human rights and sort of social justice thing. On the other side, we have the notion of settler colonialism and apartheid, and I just wondered, a significant component of that is economics and class. Was there any analysis on that?
Thank you. Yeah, the research it is a mix of qualitative and quantitative. So the quantitative was the survey, and the qualitative was then the interviews. So yeah, so that was that was the research method. On the class and economic. So I asked them lots of questions about their backgrounds in the survey and in the interviews. I didn't delve into differences in class outlook, mostly because all the research I've seen shows how the Jewish community in Britain is, by and large, now is quite homogeneous. It's a middle class community. 100 years ago, when the sort of my ancestors were arriving in the end of the 19th century, it was very much a working class refugee community.
Well, also, if you know about them, their identity characteristics and their values, in the sense you talk about the values they have in relation to race and other matters.
Okay.
That rather than their own individual.
Right, okay. What I was picking up is how they link to this wider Gen Z outlook, which seems to put great emphasis on issues around justice, racial issues, less about class and economics. Yeah.
I may have missed this, but which what percentage of your sample had served in the army, and what was their attitude to what the role of that had been in framing their views. And also, did you ask them about the resistance movement in Israel and what their attitude might be towards that? And also the riot protests that took place earlier on.
Just missed the end of the last point. Protest.
Before October, so there was the armed resistance movement of young people about the government in
Okay.
Israel.
Yeah. So none of my research participants have served in the Israeli army because they're not citizens. They're UK citizens.
Right.
So they haven't had that kind of experience.
So they're not eligible for the army.
No, they're all.
I didn't understand that.
That's okay. So everyone I was speaking to is it's very much a UK-based piece of research.
Right.
So none of them have served in the Israeli Defence Forces. Many of them have spent large chunks of time in Israel, either in kind of gap years or after they graduated. Some of them, interestingly, people I interviewed had Israeli parents who had left Israel and chosen to, sort of, for various reasons, move to the UK, and so their parents are actually Israeli, which means that they have quite a lot of extended family in Israel, which is they were quite interesting stories to hear. But nobody's had that experience of serving in the IDF.
The resistance movement, did they know about the resistance movement in Israel?
I think some of them would have recognised the limits of that protest, because the protests that were being made in Israel for months and months against the Netanyahu government's plans did not include in their protest, what was happening to Palestinians. That was really a kind of, even though the reason why these judicial reforms were taking place was because you had far-right elements within the Netanyahu current coalition that came from those settler communities in the West Bank and are determined to be able to pass laws that mean the settlements can grow and the West Bank can effectively become integrated into the rest of Israel. They didn't most of the protesters on the streets, that wasn't really what was bothering them. It was about whether democracy was being undermined for Israeli Jews.
So my question is about the political awareness of your sample, not about...
Okay, I would say that they are very plugged in to what's happening in Israel itself, and they will follow Israeli politics, and they will have typically, they've got the view as to how they saw those demonstrations, which was, yes, they would have supported them because they were against Netanyahu, but they also saw that the demonstrations were actually very limited in scope in terms of the broader Palestinian question. Thank you.
How do you get your samples? And I know that this is a reference without, but I want to know if you had thoughts on the Generation Z in Israel. What your thoughts are there? Are they blinded by Hasbara? Yeah.
How do I get the sample?
Yes.
So, various ways. So I started off by promoting the survey, which I did through social media, first of all, and then I approached other organised groups and asked them whether they would share the link. And at the end of the survey, it said if you were willing to take part in an interview, then contact me. so that then helped me generate interviewees off the back of people that were willing to do the survey. I also wrote some articles in various radical Jewish news outlets, which then also explained what the research was and encouraged people to do the survey first of all. And because I was deliberately wanting a self-selecting group, so I wasn't trying to prove that the people I was speaking to are representative. I'm not trying to come up with a percentage that says, look, these people represent 20, 30, 40% of their age group. That's not what I'm trying to do, because that's too difficult. What I do know is that they're acknowledged as a phenomenon, but they've not been researched. So nobody is trying to ask this element within this segment of Generation Z Jews, why do they think the way they think? How have they kind of travelled on this journey? What are the things that have happened to them that have made them change their whole outlook? And that's what hasn't been researched. So rather than trying to prove they represent X percentage of the community, I'm more interested at this stage is trying to understand who are they and why do they think the way they do. Jen said in Israel, I think I said to somebody, one of the other questions, I think it's a very different experience. They are much more right-wing, young Israeli Jews, more right-wing than parents and grandparents often. There is left-wing dissent still within Israeli society. Some of the people that I spoke to here were able to meet Palestinians because they travelled to Israel and then kind of hooked up with Israeli leftist groups who often go into the West Bank to try and give their support to Palestinians, often whose villages and communities might be being attacked by Israeli Jewish settler communities. So often the way in which my research participants had their face-to-face encounter was through Jewish Israeli groups, but they are tiny in terms of their significance within Israeli politics. And in terms of mainstream Israeli politics, there is a tiny Labour Party and a sort of and some parties to the left, slightly to the left of the Labour Party, but they only now get a handful of seats in Knesset elections. Most of the Israeli political support is kind of centre or to the right of centre.
What was the context in which your interviewees and survey respondents met with Arabs and Palestinians in a bit more detail? I'd love to hear that, because I think that's possibly some of the most significant and consequential part of your research, and no doubt you'll focus more on that in the future. And did you ask a follow-up question about whether or not the respondents had any views, ideas or suggestions as to how all of us could overcome the othering and the dehumanisation process? Because I think that has real practical implications and consequences. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. As I mentioned in the talk, for many of the people I interviewed, and it came through in the survey results as well, this organisation Yachad that started in 2011, which is a liberal Zionist organisation, was ironically it's had, certainly the people that I've spoken to, it's had the result of radicalising people on this issue more than they as an organisation might have anticipated. So in other words, what seemed to happen is that they would go on a tour organised by Yachad, and Yachad wanted to take them into the West Bank to see kind of how bad the situation was, because they wanted to generate within the Jewish community in the UK opposition to the occupation of Palestinian land post-1967. But often the result was that the young people who then had the opportunity to see firsthand what was going on and speak to Palestinians ended up thinking, well, hang on, it's even worse than you were telling me it was. So yeah, you told me it was bad, which is why you wanted to bring me here, and now I'm listening to it. Well, no, typically they would do things like go and sit in an Israeli military court in the West Bank, and they would watch how children or young teenagers were being treated by the Israeli kind of military court system. And witnessing that kind of thing is it's the kind of thing that blows your mind. And you see this, and you think, what the hell is going on here? This was said to me time and time again. It was just, it was literally mind blowing, and it could cause a transformation that was literally overnight. I was talking to someone else which I was interviewing this morning. She went on a visit to the South Hebron Hills to visit some of the Palestinian communities there that are under extreme attack from surrounding settlement communities. We're trying to drive them out of that part of the West Bank. And she just talked about how they were just sat in the car coming back from the visit. It was organised by a group called Breaking the Silence, which is another kind of left-wing Israeli NGO. She actually went with some of her siblings and indeed her father, who'd actually lived in Israel for a long time before moving to the UK. It's just, they kind of stunned into silence.
Just to pick up on your other point about did I kind of follow that up with questions around whether they then thought about how do you get other people to have that experience. I didn't go into a lot of detail about that, but I think what they would say is, well, the more people you can get to go there and see it, the better, because if the impact on them is that transformational, then it will be the same for other people. So I do think that's, I would say that myself in terms of the best thing you can do is go there and see it and talk to people. But people have to make their own. People have to make their own journey at the end of the day. But you can kind of, I guess they would want to encourage them, and you see a lot of sharing of information and like the person I was talking to this morning, she'd been involved in joining the Gaza Solidarity campus protests. She was explaining to me how the different Jewish groups around the country that were involved in being part of those campus protests, they were all kind of linking up with each other through WhatsApp groups. And one of the things they like to do is just share resources. So they would just say, if you want to know something about, the Nakba in 1948, have a look at this. Or there's a really great film, watch this film. So so you can see that there's a community of sharing going on typically through social media apps. So that's certainly happening. So I reckon I kind of think it's very organic, it's very grassroots. I think that's the way it's happening at the moment.
Just before we came, my son and I were listening to a track called Never Again by a Chicago metal band called Wicked, and trying to work out, Disturbed, sorry. Yeah. Correct. By a metal band called Disturbed, and trying to work out whether their passionate denouncement of Holocaust denial, and we're trying to find out their views on, the wider aspects of Israel and Zionism and things. We've not been able to find out anything about wider views, but it related to a program that's been on Radio 4 about the metal music community and what a cross-cultural, rich cross-cultural community it can be. And in that context, it talked about an Israeli and Palestinian band touring together. And I've just in the context of the general very strong support in your survey for BDS in their book of device divestment and sanctions, and that sort of cross-cultural thing in terms of the transformational effect of actually meeting, between peoples. And I just wondered how you either asked your participants or got a sense of their views about how those two things might fit together?
I'm not sure I've got a great answer to this. I wish I knew. Now you're making me think I need to explore metal music and metal music communities. It sounds brilliant. And they're definitely. I do think the way in for lots of people into this topic can be cultural, and I think people. It's. If I think about my work with Amos Trust, one of the most popular tours that we've run to the West Bank is a food tour. Because we take people to the West Bank, they meet Palestinians, and it's in the context of then enjoying brilliant food. And the food is just then a way to have deeper conversations. So I think you're absolutely right in thinking that culture, whether it's music, whether it's food, whether it's literature, has a really important role to play, and can often be a sort of less abrasive, easier way into the subject than reading kind of great historical tomes or very kind of politicized works, which for some people that's not for them, and that's not how they want to engage with it. But cultural identification or just experiencing Palestinian culture or seeing how Israeli culture and Palestinian culture can actually talk to each other in some way. There's got to be merit in that, I would say.
In the programme, what they talked about, what people in the programme talked about was that they were part of the metal music community, and it became irrelevant whether they were participants.
So the music transcends the politics. Well, that's great.
But they also had to contend with stupid media things about what the Israelis and Palestinians on a bus together. You're not stabbing each other or blowing each other up. And they just, they just got so frustrated with that portrayal of what was going on.
Yes. I understand. Thank you.
Just in terms of the BDS movement, I just wondered if your participants, had a view of how those two things fitted together.
Well, I think that I didn't go deeply into BDS there were questions in the survey that asked about it. I didn't talk about it too much in the interviews. What was clear though is that they saw it as absolutely a legitimate form of protest, and most of them would actually support it rather than just say it's legitimate. And that puts them at odds with mainstream Jewish institutional positions, which have been very, very, very anti-BDS and often characterise it as being anti-Semitic. But that's certainly that wasn't the attitude of the participants I was talking to.
Thank you. My question is about anti-Semitism. I'm interested to know from your sample whether they had an opportunity to talk about their experience of anti-Semitism, what they thought was going on, and also if they have been involved in the big protests in London, and what slogans they would feel comfortable with, and particularly, like from the river to the sea, what their response might be.
Thank you. I did in the survey, I asked questions about their experience of anti-Semitism, particularly while they were students on campus. The majority certainly said to me that they hadn't experienced anti-Semitism on campus. A vast majority also were very opposed to the way in which the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism was being used, and they felt politicised and weaponised against Palestinian solidarity. So they are certainly not supporters of the IHRA, and they see why it's problematic to Palestinian empathy and how it's being used. So that certainly came through in the survey. Anti-Semitism, it certainly came through as that they do have an understanding of anti-Semitism. They will say that they have seen it or that they've experienced it themselves, where I got into this was probably when I was talking about the Holocaust and how they relate to the Holocaust and what their teaching on the Holocaust has been and how they understand it now. And for them, they want to take the Jewish experience of oppression and prejudice and turn it into something which then enables them to embrace other people's experiences of oppression and prejudice. So what they're very uncomfortable with is the way in which Holocaust remembrance appears to have been kind of hijacked for a particular political cause. So it's not that they're against Holocaust remembrance. You know, in many ways, one person said to me, I remember this is quite, I thought this was quite profound, is that they mourned the fact that it was so difficult to actually talk about the Holocaust or commemorate or remember the incredible loss to the Jewish people because of the way it had become so politicized and the way it was used to defend Israeli behaviour so much. And it was as if it had been something very important to them had been almost taken away from them. And there was a kind of feeling of resentment about how that had happened and a desire to reshape Holocaust remembrance so that it wasn't being used in such a political way.
Can I follow up comment about
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Yes, slogan. I didn't kind of, partly because most of the interviews I did were before 7th of October, so this River to the Sea, these sort of slogans hadn't become quite such a kind of hot topic that it has become in the last 9 months. I would anticipate that they wouldn't have a problem with From the River to the Sea, and that their interpretation of that slogan would be that it is not about from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. For them, I don't think it means that it will be free of Jews. It means it will be free and that there will be freedom and equality for all who live on the land. So I would say I would say that's how they would understand that slogan, and therefore they wouldn't have a problem with it.
Excuse me if I ask a question that's not directly related to your research, but I wondered if you could make some comments about the surveys done by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, the annual surveys of the attitudes of British Jews. I've filled in a couple. Are they representative? How can they ensure that they're representative? And perhaps it would be interesting if you could anticipate what the results of the latest one are likely to show. I don't know if that's a silly question, but or if there have been any changes over the last few years in the attitudes, because they ask a lot of questions about Zionism and religion mainly. I don't think they even mention Palestinians, but by people's attitudes to Zionism, you could presumably get some idea of what they think of the Palestinian question. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Institute for Jewish Policy Research. So, for those of you who don't know, this is one of the most important gatherer of demographic data about the Jewish community in the UK. And I would say that they are a reliable source of information. And I've made in my write-up so far, I've made a lot of use of their survey data in terms of painting a picture of the broader Jewish community. They are really keen to make sure that within their sample, they do find people that are not just the people that belong to a United Synagogue and have quite right-wing views, or they do their best to try and make sure that the sample is as broad as possible. And one of the noteworthy things that came out of a survey that was published before October the 7th, and it was a big survey of Jewish identity in the United Kingdom, and it was the first time in 10 years that they had done this survey. And one of the things they found is is the percentage of people who were willing to identify as Zionist had dropped by 10% overall compared to the figures from 2013. So it had gone from 73% of people willing to identify as Zionist to only 63%. And if you looked at the Gen Z cohort, it was only, I think, 57 or 56%, so it was significantly lower. So the lower down the age group you went, the less Zionist identifying people were willing to be. And they also, I can't remember the exact numbers now, I think there were about 8% of people that were willing to say that they were anti-Zionist, and I think a large number that would say they were non-Zionist. So actually you had quite a proportion of people who weren't signed up to Zionism. Now some of that's because they may not quite understand what does this word even mean anymore, and there's lots of dispute about how you define it. But it was, I think that was a kind of interesting finding. Now I think the survey you're referring to is the one that's just, it might still be live, it's about political attitudes currently, and I can't wait for that to come out. I'm really hoping that they publish it before I finish my write-up, because they have asked all the questions that I would like to ask about how the Jewish community is actually thinking about what's happened since October the 7th. Lots of very specific questions about how people are seeing that. And I think that will be incredibly interesting to see the results of that. And I think by and large, I think that's the only organisation whose data I would trust. There are lots of other fast and loose surveys that you might see published by the Jewish Chronicle or Campaign for Anti-Semitism. Don't trust any of that stuff. But I think the stuff that's JPR do, I think, is pretty solid.
I was just curious to know whether the participants in your group had any, or harboring any views on the resistance put up by the Palestinians, and especially Hamas. And number two, did you ever encounter any opposition to the work that you are doing?
So I didn't ask people specifically about what they think about Hamas, whether they viewed what happened on October the 7th as legitimate resistance or illegitimate resistance. I suspect most of them would say that it was an act of resistance. Whether it was legitimate or not is a kind of a different question, but it came out of something, it didn't kind of come out of nothing. So there are ways to contextualise and explain it, which I'm sure they would be able to articulate. But it's not something that I got into with, partly because most interviews happened before October the 7th. So I haven't got a clear answer for that. I would certainly say that in more general terms, they recognise the legitimacy of Palestinian resistance more generally, in that they have a right to resist what has happened to them. I would doubt that many of the people I spoke to would say that what happened on October the 7th itself was kind of acceptable or ethical or moral. I think they would have a big problem with that. But they would certainly put it within a broad political context. Were you asking about opposition to me doing the research? Okay, yeah. So I did get kickback. One of the places, perhaps foolishly, I posted a call to people to take part in the research within the Leeds Jewish Community Facebook page. Huge mistake. I knew that probably Gen Z Jews probably aren't really on Facebook. That's not that is not their social media platform of choice. But I thought maybe their parents might be. Anyway, I got an awful lot of kickback and very negative responses about the mere fact that I was trying to research this. Some people took enormous issue with and thought that I was just recruiting for terrible people. I got into lots of protracted conversations trying to explain what I was doing and why I was doing it, none of that worked, and I just learned a lesson about not using that particular platform ever again.
Well, I think that I'm going to permit myself to ask a question. I'd just like to say thank you, Bob. It's been really, really interesting. I've got so many questions down here about Holocaust remembrance. One thing that occurred to me when you mentioned that your cohort saw this as a racial justice issue, in contrast, I think, to something, and not about the land. But my experience is of Palestinian people, and seeing Palestinian people talk is their connection with the land is very, very deep. And whether your cohort, maybe you didn't ask them this, but whether they appreciated that or how they saw that Palestinian perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think they would recognise, or they do recognise, the importance of the land in terms of Palestinian understanding of culture and history. And I think when it was clear that they see it through this lens of racialised discrimination, that didn't mean that they were then discounting the importance of land for the Palestinians, but they were understanding what had happened to them and their dispossession or the denial of their actual connection to the land through the fact that they had been racialised through this project of Zionism. And I think that's what they're seeing.
And I'm conscious of the time. There's just a couple of announcements. Once again, please give Robert thanks everybody so much for coming. There is